Hey, what's up, guys? Little man with the big opinion here. So, I've got a new story that I want to talk about today and, just discuss why we should be prepared and, the importance of seeing stuff like this. I consider this a very happy ending. Uh, it's definitely what I consider the best of this worst case scenario. And the key theme of this video is being able to take action. um, and I would just toss in, I'm gonna toss in my own 2 cents. So let me know what you think about this in the comment section down below. Subscribe to the channel and share this with your friends and family. um, you know Pick any number of articles. There's no way that you can really twist this in a you know, good or bad way. I went with the New York Post on this one. Dramatic moment, Oklahoma principal Kirk Moore tackles Columbine obsessed school shooter while also being shot himself. Um, so, the simple rundown is a 20-year-old stole some handguns from his father and, went to the school, claimed he didn't like the principal, uh, claimed that he was going to do, similar things like they did at Columbine. The principal came out when he heard the commotion. There was a student in, I guess this is like the entryway of the school, and the gunman, you know, points a firearm at the principal. Apparently, it malfunctions. Uh, the principal is struck in the leg, but manages to tackle the student. Is wrestling the gun away from him. Another, uh, teacher or someone at the school. They just say he's uh, another adult male. Steps in and helps get the gun out of his hand. They subdue him. Guy gets arrested. He's probably going to spend a very significant amount of time behind bars, and the principal is, expected to make a full recovery. Went to the hospital, got all of his, had his injury dealt with. And I'd also say that this principal's, 65 years old. Uh, Pretty sure he's 60. He's either 60 or 65. Um, So, the guy admitted that he didn't like the principal and that he was, one of the people he went there uh, to kill. And, they're praising him for saving lives and doing all that good stuff. So, the one argument that I could make here, it doesn't say if this guy was still living with his dad. Um, you know, I don't know any background. I don't know if the firearms were, in a safe, you know, if they were out of sight. But, you know, depending on who the person is, they might know, codes to this kind of stuff anyway. So that's definitely definitely something to take into consideration. Like that's my only, kind of negative thing to say in here. Uh, my big key takeaway from this would be you should be capable of great violence and know when to use it. If I've heard the argument that you shouldn't be able to, you know, harm people, and I've heard the argument that if you're a peaceful person but don't know how to be violent, then you're useless. Um, it goes back to that old saying of, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. It's in a lot of ways I consider it like flipping a switch. You whatever training and stuff that you do, you know, no one at my work except for administrators and things like that know that I'm able to carry a firearm. Like no, the only people that know is the principal and like school resource officers and things like that. And that's how it should go. You know, your students should see you as a teacher first. But if that situation ever arises, you're capable of doing the things to protect yourself and the others in your environment. And I was talking to our camp ranger. I work at a scout camp, and we have policies in place for that. We've had random people show up on the property. Sometimes it's just an accident. They're walking through the woods and they got onto our property. Someone's boat runs out of gas, so they come up to our lakefront and we help them out. But if you are not capable of violence, then you're setting yourself up to be a victim. And this goes across the entire world. It spans gender, age, all of these different categories. That's why I harp on physical fitness and training with your firearms and taking medical classes and doing all of the things, because you never know when you'll have to implement those things. I remember helping someone that got in a motorcycle accident, and EMS took another 5-10 minutes to get there. I don't think the guy was going to die from his wounds before EMS was able to help him out. But I definitely helped alleviate some of the suffering, and that's not my primary function to help people. I'm in education. If I only focused on teaching the classes that I teach, then that guy's suffering would have gone a little bit longer. Their injuries could have been worse. Death's always a possibility, but that's why we train and do the things that we do. This principle's quick actions. This is one of those situations where one person was shot in the leg and they're expected to make a full recovery. The gunman was subdued and is going to pay for their crimes. My brain is set up to think that the worst possible outcome is every single unfired bullet is a injured or dead person. And so I'm not a judge. Some people would probably like me to be a judge, because I would place an attempted murder charge for every round that you had with you. That's just my thinking on this. And it takes good people with courage and strength to stop bad people. There's that old saying, the only thing that stops bad guys with guns is good guys with guns. You can apply that to everything. The only thing that stops a bad strong person is a good strong person. This was a very selfless action. I'm looking at the comments on this. There's 180 of them. The very top comment says, "This is why teachers should be allowed to carry on campus." Part of me, I agree with this. when I think of a 65-year-old, I think of my grandparents. I think he was very lucky. I know he's probably gone through training stuff. He did exactly what they teach us is, if you're in this situation and you, need to confront the person, you make a bunch of loud noise and you rush them. I've taken my concealed handgun class. They say someone rushing at you with, any sort of weapon, if they're within 21 feet, then, that becomes a deadly situation. So he did everything that he was supposed to do. But, I think of the age difference there. I'm not dogging on the principal, but it could have gone much worse because there's a 40-year, a sneeze. There's a 40-year age gap there. But I think that goes into, a certain level of training. I think adrenaline played a role. I think the training that he took played a role. But I know the older that you get, the more difficult these things can get for you. I also think of it, from a strength perspective. This generally applies to women and smaller people. I've told you plenty of times, I'm 5'2", weigh 130 pounds. Looking at this guy's mugshot, he's 6'1". I'd make the argument, based off of looking at his face, he's probably got at least 80 pounds on me, if not more. It does not matter the amount of martial arts, jujitsu, karate, whatever I know. Once you get about 50 pounds heavier than someone, the idea of mass moves mass, that would be a very difficult situation for me to handle without a firearm, which is why I advocate so much for carrying one. I say anyone and everyone should carry one as long as they go through, whatever they're supposed to go through. I want to go home to my family. If I didn't have a family, I'd want to go home for myself. And so, I agree with this top comment. It specifically says teachers and admin who are willing should be allowed to carry on campus. Because I understand not everyone wants to have that, burden of responsibility. This comment, every school should have metal detectors and at least 3 cops on duty. I think that's a little excessive. But, we live in a society that, we shouldn't have to worry about this kind of stuff, but we do. As a prepper, I think we add a bunch more worrying on top of, everything. You shouldn't have to buy, solar and backup batteries. But, we had a bad storm over the weekend. The power went out for 2 seconds. It was just long enough to cancel me playing Battlefield, and I had to wait for everything to restart, and, I lost 10 minutes of time. That's a modern first world problem. But if it stayed out for a length of time, it starts warming up in the house. It stays out longer, stuff in the fridge and freezer start to go bad. Not having lights to get things done. We shouldn't have to worry about this kind of stuff, but we think about all of these scenarios where bad things can happen, and we prepare for them. We spend our money on, gear, supplies, and skills so that we can be better prepared for stuff like this. I'm a big proponent for, it's not the firearm's fault. It's, evil people are going to do evil things. You can look at other places where they've mostly removed firearms from the equation. If someone wants to do a bad thing, they're going to do the bad thing. That's why people are, injured, hurt, crimes are committed with things other than firearms. Anything that gives you an advantage over just a plain individual person. Be it brass knuckles, a baseball bat, a hammer, a knife, anything that gives you an edge, lets that evil person commit that evil thing easier. Which is why I consider the firearm the great equalizer. I stick with the saying that good people stop bad people. And I want to be able to stop a bad thing from happening the easiest way possible. I work out 5 or 6 days a week. I can do all the push-ups, running's okay, pull-ups, lifting weights, all that sort of stuff. It only takes about 3.5 pounds to pull a trigger. And so that is expending the least amount of energy that I can possibly do to stop a bad situation. I might not even have to use 3.5 pounds of pressure. Firearms have stopped bad things from happening without the trigger ever being pulled. And, this goes down to, how you raise people, and, you don't have to be religious to look at, things like the Golden Rule, the 10 Commandments, that sort of thing, to know the difference between right and wrong. I think the religion stuff helps, but it's, I'm not going to try to tell you you have to do this or you have to do that. That's the libertarian in me. So I'm glad this ended the way that it ended. Like I said at the beginning, best situation out of this, worst case scenario. No one died. One person was injured. The evil person will face their justice. And, at this point, I can just hope that, judges or juries or anyone involved in this will, implement a appropriate level of justice. We could argue, death penalty, hard labor, life behind bars, whatever. That's something for a different discussion. You can let me know in the comment section down below what you think should happen. Part of me says, he should experience being shot in the leg. That's an eye for an eye. Part of me says, you don't get to be a part of society anymore. Whether that's, death penalty or life behind bars. People make the argument that we're feeding and taking care of someone and they're not contributing. And, the Christian in me also says that, people can be reformed and make changes. But it's going to be a lot of, there has to be a lot of time involved and a lot of stuff that would need to happen for that to even become a consideration. So hopefully they do what they're supposed to do. I'm going to wrap this up. Subscribe to the channel if you like hearing about this kind of stuff. Like the video if you enjoy it, dislike it if you don't. More importantly, share this with your friends and family. We are still slowly growing, and I do my best to answer all the comments that I can, and we'll see how this happens. But until then, I'll catch you in the next one.